Hello, everybody. I'd like to thank everyone for attending our virtual spring seminar. We ask that you bear with us if we encounter any technical difficulties. We're not professionals and this isn't our day job. I would also like to mention that our morning session tomorrow begins at 8:50 a.m. Those first 10 minutes, as these are designed to let you get situated and make sure your setup is working and get you comfortable for the event. It also allows us to share our announcements. In between sessions on Thursday morning and Thursday afternoon, we're going to run some polls and facts to share with you about our platinum sponsors. We'll call them in-betweeners, and those will allow us to transition behind the scenes. They also provide you an opportunity to stretch your legs, get some water, etc. And I would like to thank our platinum sponsors, GPI, Grape, and AIRS. We wouldn't be able to provide you these experiences in this enhanced manner without the support of those sponsors. Tomorrow on Thursday evening, we will have some social night events. One is happy hour, and it will be hosted by our speaker earlier today, Frank Conkling of Panda Consulting. So be sure to consider joining us for that. And later on that night, we will have a trivia contest at 7 p.m. There are prizes that are donated by those aforementioned platinum sponsors. They range from $25 to $50 gift cards, and the top four finishers in the trivia contest will get those prizes. If you haven't signed up, please consider it for any of our sessions. Remember, it's free. Finally, on Friday, we will have our special interest group meetings on SIG Day. SAGIC, MUG, and Women in GIS will all meet that day. Our spring event will culminate with our monthly WLA board meeting, which is open to anyone who would wish to tune in and check it out. And that will be Friday afternoon. If you enjoy these sessions and workshops the WLA has hosted in this event, consider donating to the WLA Foundation. There's a link to do so on our spring virtual meeting information page. And this is a way for us to recoup the lost ability to fundraise with a raffle during our regular meeting. So please consider donating the money. It goes to the Damon Anderson Memorial Scholarship Fund, and remember, it's for the kids. Thank you to all who have put the time into these workshops today. I encourage you to please take some time and fill out a survey following this event so that we take that information, and that feedback is what helps us make decisions on meeting format, content, and more. This information is especially important as we may need to plan for other virtual events in the future, such as the fall. So I thank you and ask that you please consider that. And at this time, I'll turn things over to Jason Poser, our spring virtual meeting chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I just wanted to give thanks to the Spring Regional Education Committee and all the assistance they have provided us moving forward here. We're heading into the second workshop of the day, and I really don't have any more comments other than please make sure that you provide any comments or questions regarding these sessions back to us. The feedback is very important. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Sarah Rollins for her presentation. Sarah, please take it away.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll just bear with us while we get Sarah's audio connected.
Hello, folks. This is Coulter Sikora, and while Sarah and the gang are working on that, I do have a little bit of introductory comments and whatnot that I can pass along as well. So a few things that you should know, so you're basically best participating in today's event. If you haven't figured it out already, you're joining this presentation using your computer's speaker system by default for audio. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone in the audio pane in your attendee control panel to the right of your screen, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters, including Sarah and Drew, by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect those questions and address them during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email with within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording. And here in the meantime, I'll go ahead and give kind of a contextual intro to Sarah Rollins and Drew Fioranelli with Datamark. Sarah is a public safety GIS expert at Datamark. Sarah has worked in GIS over the last 30 years and has worked with public safety for 4 years. She also has 15 years as a technical trainer and training designer. Her areas of expertise include GIS data projects involving assessing and remediating public safety data for E911 and Next Generation 911, educating public safety GIS professionals on best practices and standards for maintaining public safety grade GIS data, and designing workflows to optimize public safety database management and accuracy. Sarah is also a contributing member of the NENA GIS data transition. Drew Fioranelli, GISP, has over 12 years of experience working on Next Gen 911 and GIS-related projects focused on integrating spatial technologies to support local government public safety response. He is an expert with GIS workflows, the full suite of Esri products, as well as enterprise and relational database management systems. Drew is currently the president of the Geospatial Information and Technology Association, a global nonprofit whose mission is to educate, advocate, and provide opportunities for networking and connecting geospatial professionals together. And pending our audio connections and whatnot are up and online, we should be ready to go. Sarah and Drew, are you out there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you so much. Yes, and thank you for the great intro. And I trust Drew is on the line as well. I will bring him in a moment. Great. All right. Thank you all so much for having us. Good afternoon. And I'm really glad that you are here for this workshop. This is a workshop about Next Generation 911 data preparedness. So for those of you I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting or working with, as Coulter said, my name is Sarah Rollins. I'm a public safety GIS expert with Datamark, and we're very excited to be addressing Wisconsin again today. Your state has grown very dear to me as I've been building relationships with many of you over the last several months, and through my interactions with you, I have come to realize that people in GIS in Wisconsin seem to have an excellent grasp of Next Gen and how it differs from legacy 911. And so again, we're very honored to be presenting to your group again today. At Datamark, one of the cornerstones of the work we do with people is education about GIS and Next Gen. And we most often deliver presentations about Next Gen basics, very much high-level overviews. When considering what I wanted to present to you all today, however, I wanted to accomplish two things. The first, I wanted to give a very brief overview of GIS and Next Gen to catch anyone up that needs it, needs a brusher. The second, I wanted to give you so much more than that, basic overview, because I know that many of you are far beyond those basics. My conversations with you about validating your data for Next Gen are indicative of you being further along the Next Gen readiness path. I'm going to go over our agenda in brief here. We're going to cover that overview and then we're going to take a deeper dive into the weeds of next-gen GIS data preparedness. So we'll start out discussing why the way 911 does business needed to change and the impacts of GIS on next-gen. We'll talk a bit about NENA and NENA requirements, and about GIS data sources and providers that might impact your next-gen data set. Then we'll have a brief discussion about the 98 and what that means to you. Then after that, the weeds, because it's one thing to validate your data for performance in next-gen systems, but it's quite another to prepare your data for those validations. So we're going to take a step back and define and identify the pre-validation steps of preparing your data with accuracy and completeness to give it the respect it deserves. And I say respect because this is where the knowledge and intuition of the GIS professionals working with this data really comes into play. We'll talk about establishing an order of operations for working with the required data layers. We'll go over parsing and what it means to NENA, as well as what we like to call address dynamics. We'll, of course, talk about schema, and then we'll touch on validations for next-gen and the categories that you'll be wanting to think about as you move into your data remediation and maintenance phase. And this brings me to my wonderful colleague, Drew Fioranelli. I asked Drew to join me today because I really appreciate how Drew takes a deeper dive into complete and correct data preparedness for next-gen. We'd like today's presentation to be as interactive as possible. We'll have some polling questions, and we're also going to take some time for some brief conversations if we can work that in technologically. So please use the chat feature here and keep the dialogue going with us as we go along. Without further ado then, I would like to introduce you to Drew Fioranelli.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much. And I really want to thank everybody on the call today for providing us this opportunity to come and speak with you and hopefully educate you on some things that are really passionate for both Sarah and I. So before we get into the content, I do want to introduce myself a little bit. I think Coulter did a fantastic job, so I really appreciate that initial introduction. But as Coulter said, I have over 13 years of experience working with local government GIS. In most instances, I actually built the GIS programs for the local governments that I was working for. So that gives me a unique insight into what it takes to actually go from nothing to something, as well as how to continue identifying what unique ways to integrate GIS into daily practice. And something that I really fell in love with was the usage of GIS in public safety and 911. My entire career as in GIS has really kind of had this background focus on public safety, being that I am from Mississippi, and I had the distinct pleasure of learning GIS right after Hurricane Katrina. So the main focus for my educators was making sure GIS would work for 911 and public safety, with the conceptual idea that if it worked for public safety, it would work for everybody else. And so I've kind of carried that with me throughout my career. And now I'm in a position where I can really just hone in and focus on GIS and how to implement GIS in public safety. And what a great time to be in GIS with next generation 911 really becoming a deeper part of the current conversation. And so I really hope you guys get a lot out of this. And we're really excited to, one, talk to you about the initial need for change and why next gen 911 has been an important part of the conversation in the past, and why you're really starting to see it dig its heels in right now. So with that, Sarah, why don't we get into really understanding the need for change? Right. So this I really want to focus on call routing. I know Sarah's presented from you guys before, and some of you may be familiar with call routing, and we really want to first focus on what call routing looks like in the legacy environment or current state 911 versus what it's going to look like as we move towards next gen 911. So on the left side of our screen here, we really see our databases, our MSAG, our master street address guide, and our ALI, our automatic location identification database, right? Those are two databases that are really driving that call routing component to 911. And then we kind of flip over to Next Gen 911, and we see this focus on a spatial interface, GIS data, and LVF and ECRF for location validation function and emergency call routing function. When we get there, let's really focus a little more on this MSAG and this alley. Right, so our master street address guide at the top, or our MSAG. I would love to see just in the chat window, or a show of hands, just to kind of get an idea for the number of folks on the call that are familiar with working with or have seen an MSAG. That's generally a good indicator for us for who's familiar with the terms that we're talking about. But I'm going to go through this in depth with you. So the MSAG is maintaining our records of our high and low address ranges, our pre-directionals like our north, south, east, and west, our street names, our community values, which are really important for us, our state, whether or not the right side of the road or left side of the road is odd or even, and our ESN values, right? So we're getting a lot of detailed information about things that are in space, right? Really pertaining to how we manage our roads and our road center lines throughout our communities. And then we have our alley, or our automatic location information database, that is really tracking. So from a GIS perspective, think of point data, right? Our address point data. This is representative of that, but it's identifying a phone number to a home address, which really is kind of how 911 works, right? You call from your home landline, because we all still have those, right? And when your number pops up at CAD, it also is associated with address, right? A routable address or a post address, something that's like 123 Main Street or 127 North Main Street. And then also a part of that is that ESN value, or that emergency service number, which is going to identify services and what station and what PSAP to send a call to and how to route services, right? So that ESN number is really the only spatial component to these two databases, right? Because it's related to something in space. But what's really important to remember about both of these data sets is they're both tabular, which is really create a problem for us in a next gen 911 world, because none of this information, nothing is carried in either of these data sets that relates to space or where things are located in space, right? Like our XY values or even our Z values as we're getting into next gen 911. So how have we operated for almost 50 years on data sets that are not spatial, when pretty much everything around 911 is related to something in space? So this is one of the biggest transitions we're going to see moving into a next generation 911 environment, and why GIS is such a cornerstone of this transition, right? So Sarah, if we can click to the next slide, I really kind of want to start putting this into some different terms, right? So the way GIS data is used right now in our PSAPs, or our public safety answering points, our 911 centers, is kind of what we really refer to as after the call, right? So if you look at the image that's on your screen right now, you see the left side is blank and the right side shows our call taker, our operator, a map, and then service deployment. Well, GIS is in that mapping component, so that CAD map, right? So by the time we get there, your call taker or your operator has already answered the call, has started their interrogation process to identify the what and where, right? So where are you and what's wrong with you? So I know how to dispatch service, and then trying to correlate the verbal information giving over the phone with what has shown up on their CAD console along with maybe access to a GIS map that's on another monitor. So, you know, double check, triple check, and quadruple check location information to make sure we're sending the service to the right place. Right, so GIS in this instance is a post-call function and has no relation to the decision-making process between the time I hit send on 911 and someone picks up. Well, in NextGen, we start to see that change. So if you'll click for me, Sarah, right, perfect. Now we get GIS in a pre-call component, right? So in this instance, when our caller dials 911 and hits send, before our call taker or our dispatcher, if they're the same person, pick up that call at 911, GIS has already been targeted to make some decisions. And the first decision that GIS data is going to make is where to send the call, right? That call routing component. So if I'm here in County A, I want to make sure that my call goes to the PSAP that's responsible for that location in County A. I don't want it to go to the neighboring PSAP because now we're losing time on figuring out that, you know, I'm not where I need to be and I'm not talking to the people I need to talk to. So it's going to delay the amount of time it takes for me to get the help that I need. So it's really important to remember that GIS now sits in this critical component of call routing in NextGen 911 and is used pre-call to make decisions on where to send the call. That is extremely powerful and is extremely important, but it also requires us to make sure the data that we're putting into this system to support this mission critical component is as accurate as it can be, right? And that's where NextGen comes along, right? So moving away, and I put away in air quotes because nothing's really going to go away. It's going to take more of a back seat for a little while, being our MSAG and our alley, and really starting to put more focus on GIS, right? So now we can see that transition from the 911 authority, GIS data, so authoritative data sets that have been compared and evaluated and are as accurate and as close to reality as we can get, are moving into this new component of 911, the spatial interface. And that spatial interface is going to push our GIS data into our location validation function, which is responsible for identifying if it's a verifiable address in that 911 call process, and our emergency call routing function, which is determining where to send the call based on the information in GIS, as well as the location of the caller, right? So extremely powerful stuff, right? It's very exciting to be in GIS right now, but now that I've kind of talked a little bit about call routing, let me actually show you what that means and how it can get relatively complex. Right, so I provided a definition for you for geospatial call routing. The process of using GIS data in the decision-making process of identifying where to route a 911 call to what PSAP based on the geographic location of the caller. Right, so in our example on the screen, we have PSAP A and PSAP B, and their primary service areas identified by their different colored boundaries. So if I'm at caller X, I want to make sure that the PSAP that's picking up my call is PSAP B, right? In this instance, this is relatively easy to accomplish, right? In a legacy environment, right? Especially the further away from boundaries we get, so more central to the PSAP boundary or the county boundary that we get makes it a little easier to identify location, right? But not everybody operates this way. We know that there's some complexities that are interjected based on density, right? So if we look at our next example, we see something that gets a little more complicated and why GIS data is extremely important and is accurate, right? So now we have PSAPs A through F, right? And if I'm still caller X, now I want to make sure that PSAP F is the one that's picking up my call. So some of the things I need to think about is, since now I'm using GIS data, do I have coincident boundaries with my neighbors? Are there any gaps or overlaps? How often is my data updated? And have we made some decisions together between PSAP boundaries to ensure that our data, the data that I have is the data that they have and vice versa. Right? So hopefully you're seeing how this can get very complex and complicated, and where, the accuracy of our GIS data really plays a significant role. Right? So now that we've talked about call routing, let's talk a little more about the location validation function and the emergency call routing function. Right? As I said before, LVF really pre-validates the static location of the caller. So is this a verifiable location? Right? Valid locations are pre-verified against the GIS data. Right? Again, calling for accuracy of GIS data. And it's important to know that if that caller cannot be identified, or that location the caller is calling from is not verified, then we're able to generate some sort of discrepancy reporting so that we can correct it. Right? Which is not something that we currently exist in a current state 911 system for E911 or emergency 911. Typically, those discrepancy reports, quote unquote, are notes that are taken by a call taker or a dispatcher and then pushed to a shift supervisor or a PSAT manager, who then has to figure out the right person. If they have a great relationship with their GIS person, it may go to GIS, or maybe there's someone at 911 that's responsible for updating information when something's not either routed or something's not a verifiable location. In our next-gen 911 system, those discrepancy reports are created in that spatial interface, as well as our location validation function and our emergency call routing function. So that's really good to know, right? So our ECRF, where do I send the call, right? So my first step is making sure that it's a valid and verifiable location as it matches up against our GIS data. Now I need to use some sort of boundary information to determine where to send the call, right? That's our PSAT boundary. And this is going to ensure that the call is sent to the right PSAT to expedite getting service out the door, right? So we're going to perform spatial queries against our GIS data based on the location of the caller. And keep in mind, all of this occurs before anyone ever picks up the phone. Right? Because as I said, it's in that pre-call process, and GIS is making the decisions. And then the call taker will be able to identify and verify the information that's being shown on their screen based on the decisions that were made in that pre-call process, right? Against LVF and ECRF. Hopefully that makes sense for you guys. Again, please leverage the chat window if you have any questions. My goal is to make sure that you don't leave with any questions. If you have some coming in, let's get them out while we're here. Or if something sparks a question for you, or we need to take a little deeper dive or take some more time explaining something, please let me know. All right, so in our next slide, we want to look at the entire system, right? So far, we've focused a lot on that call routing component, which is really part of our spatial interface, our ECRF, and our LVF. But if we look at the entire call process, we can identify that this is a complete overhaul from currently how things are done at our legacy or our current state 911. All right, so working our way left to right, we see that we have our call that's originating from a landline, a wireless line, or voice over IP line, right? It's going through our boundary control function and into our emergency service routing proxy, right? And eventually will make its way to our spatial interface to ping our GIS data to identify if we have a pre-validated location in our LVF and how to route that call through our ECRF. What's also interesting to notice, in the upper left, you'll see the location information server, the LIS, or the location database, our LDB. That is what is going to become of your alley. Your alley is going to kind of evolve or transition into this LIS or LDB, right? Which operates as part of your location validation function. Right. So once we can pre-validate a call, the location of the call, that location exists, we can match it to our GIS data, and then we know where to route it to the accuracy of the data in our emergency call routing function. Now that call gets pushed to our call taker, who can then verify all of that information in their CAD map. So it's a complete overhaul of our 911 system. It's not a patch, repair, and replace. So that's why we've had, you know, next generation 911 a part of the conversation for so long. Is it's taking a while to figure out the correct way to do this overhaul, and now we're at a point where you're starting to see big change coming, and a lot of focus put on specific parts of this, right? And I also want to mention that you see your EZNet, you're right there in the center of the screen where your spatial interface, your emergency call routing function, and your emergency service routing proxy sit. That is a new component for 911 that has to be constructed, right? Either at state level or regional level, because that is what is driving the capabilities of next gen 911. Right? So if you have any questions on this, please use the chat window. Let us know. Happy to address this in further detail with you guys. My goal was to show you how call routing and GIS were going to function in this new environment, because now we know our GIS data is part of that infrastructure via our spatial interface, our location validation function, and our emergency call routing function. All right, Sarah, if you want to go to the next slide for me, that would be fantastic. All right, so I wanted to provide you guys with some resources, right? One, to show you that all of the information throughout this slide presentation or throughout this presentation comes from NENA documentation, right? I don't think these are all of them. I think we're actually missing one or two in here, but this is the majority. These are some good places to start if you're wanting to learn more about next generation 911 and specific components like addressing or the GIS data model, right? I will, however, require you, or strongly suggest as required reading for you, this next slide, which is the NEMA Standard for NG911 GIS data model. This document was recently updated. You'll see about midway of the page, NENA STA 006.1.1-2020. Make sure if you're doing research and you want to read through this document, it's about 110 pages. The first 10 pages have some really solid information. The rest of the documentation is supporting information for those first 10 pages. Make sure you're using the current document because this one did recently get updated. You'll see one out there, the previous document, which is the 2018 document. So keep in mind, these are constantly getting updated. Make sure you have the current one. This is a great one to start on. Read this document. It's going to explain a lot of information about the schema necessary to support the geospatial call routing activities of Next Gen 911. And I would also encourage you to read a document. It's called CLDXF. It's the Civic Location Data Exchange Function. That's the one that I don't have in here, but I'm happy to get that to you guys if you want it.
Excellent. Thanks, Drew. We actually have 3 questions that are in so far already. If we can take a couple of minutes and go through those, if you and Sarah are up for that.
Absolutely. I love it.
Excellent. I'll work in reverse chronological order. So I'm sorry to Hannah, who sent one in at 110. Robert at 120 asked, how are the multiple PSAP boundaries typically defined? Legal description?
That is a great question. It's going to really start with the local entities. So when you are defining your PSAP boundaries, you can start with something like a municipal or a county boundary, but you really want to bring your neighbors to the table, right? Because we have to ensure that we don't have any gaps or overlaps in our boundary locations. And really the only way you're going to do that is if you're working together with your neighbors to make those decisions. A good place to start, if you have an existing PSAP boundary, start there. Or if you have a county boundary or a municipal boundary, really we want to determine the service area for our primary PSAP for both localities and kind of see where they fall together on a map. Both parties come to the table, identify where there's discrepancies, and then figure out a way to remediate those discrepancies and then document the decisions that were made. Some folks may decide to work with a vendor for this. There are companies out there that can help you facilitate these conversations. But I would encourage you to start reaching across the aisle and creating those crosswalks with your neighbors to have these discussions, because it can take a while to really refine and get to a point where it's ready to operate in this functionality.
Hey, Drew, I know we've got 2 questions, but I'm thinking let's launch our poll, because that's the next slide. Let's launch the poll, and then while people are responding, we can hear the other 2 questions.
Yeah, absolutely. That works for me.
All right, great. All right, so we have our first poll question, which is, have you read the Next Gen 911 data model document? And go ahead, be honest. These are all anonymous, nothing to worry about. And we're just really curious because we know that it's a great document and it's a heady document. So I'll go ahead and let you, Coulter, if you want to go ahead with the other questions for Drew while people are responding.
Sounds great. Nearly half of you have responded already, which is fantastic. But on to that next question. Art asks, where is the caller location coming from?
So the caller location is coming from, and I may have to pull Sarah in to help me out with this a little bit. It's coming from whatever device they're calling from, as well as still using cell phone towers to identify location. We know location is going to vary based on whether or not you're wireless phase 1 or wireless phase 2. So a lot of that, to be honest, I don't have a real good grasp on the details of that information. I'm happy to get it for you. If you're using a third-party product like Rapid SOS, it's going to increase the accuracy of the information from the call. And Sarah, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there hasn't been any changes yet for the amount of information that comes across the wireless line from the wireless providers, right? We know some of that information gets scrubbed, which is related to caller location. What are your thoughts on it? You've worked around that a little more than I have. Maybe together we can come up with a solid answer.
Sure, absolutely. Well, of course, we have to think about first, is the caller coming from a cell versus VoIP versus landline? And landline's kind of a no-brainer because we know that with a landline number, we do have a fixed location. So I'm just going to kind of table that because really what Next Gen is addressing is the increasing number of 911 calls that are coming from phones on the move, so of course cell phones. And as Drew said, you're spot on. It really depends on phase 1, phase 2. It depends on the caller's actual device. It depends on the tower that's receiving the call, and also maybe I can't see the question, but I'm going to also venture into the location of the caller. There's also really important verbal data. When a call comes in to the PSAP, the call taker is going to be very experienced in asking questions that can help really refine where the caller is, because when a cell call comes in, even if it's a phase 2, and sometimes even if you have something like Rapid SOS, there's still going to be what they call the radius of confidence, which means we're going to see a point on the map if they're using a mapping display, but we're still not absolutely sure. And so this information, this is what comes into play, and we're going to discuss this a little bit later on today. This is when your landmark information is also so important, because that might be the information that comes in with the call, is the caller's ability to verbally articulate, hey, I'm across the corner from Walgreens, or I'm, on the south of Lake Johnson, or, something like that. that will help the call taker to further refine where that caller is. So I'm curious to know if we answered, whoever asked that question, I'd love to know if we answered that to your satisfaction.
Cool. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah,
Absolutely,
I think so.
we do. Yes, sir.
Awesome. So the last one, which dates back to 110, is from Hannah, who asks and says, the city of Milwaukee uses DIME, that is dual independent map encoding. We did just update that data. Is that different than the tabular data that was on the quote unquote last slide? Whatever slide was up at 110, if that rings a bell at all.
I'm going to assume that your question is relative to the MSAG and ALI. And without being familiar with your DIME system, I'm happy to go offline and discuss this with you. Just based on your question and the slide I think we were on, I would say yes. But with some more information from you about that system, I'll be able to refine that answer a little better. I know that's kind of an answer that's also kind of a non-answer, but I would encourage you just reach out to me directly, provide more information about that system, and I can help address that question a lot better. Hope that helps.
All right. Thank you both, Drew and Sarah. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Just about 3/4 of you all voted, which is excellent. And one of the things I'm not familiar with is how these things display. So I hurried up and wrote down the results, closing that poll. And I do have the results in front of me. I can go ahead and share those as well. So there you go. I don't know if Drew or if
awesome.
Sarah, if you want to comment on that at all before we move on.
Yeah, that's great.
So thank you for the honesty, number one. I love that some of you have not read it. Some of you have kind of looked through it. It's a daunting document. So I know if you open it up and you start down the path of reading it, it can be a little overwhelming. I get that some folks have read it and don't really understand what it's saying. And some of you have read it and you get it. That's great. This is typically kind of what we see. If you've read it and you don't get it, hopefully after today's presentation, it'll make a little more sense, because we do focus a little more on information that's in that document as it really pertains to GIS professionals and starting down this path of next-gen 911 GIS data development integration. So yeah, and if you haven't read it yet, I would encourage you to at least skim through it or start down the path of reading. It's a great document.
Yes, and I'm really glad to see these results, because this is exactly what Drew and I felt was the right workshop to deliver today, because this is going to speak to, it's going to speak to all of you, but those lucky 10% of you who read it and get it, I'm just really excited that we're presenting this information to you today. I wish we could maybe we can even look at Coulter and Jeremy, maybe we can look at the end of the presentation, maybe running this poll again and seeing if people might answer this a little bit differently. We'll see. But anyway, I'm just excited because we're giving you this information exactly. All right, I'm going to move to the next slide. You okay with that, Drew? And move into the next section.
Absolutely.
By all means, send more questions as they come in.
Okay, yes. Just
ping
us. I think this is working well, our little chat on the side here, so that's great. So I'm going to talk about the required data sets. We're going to go over them briefly. And again, these are the NENA required data sets that are talked about in that wonderful data model document that we were just talking about. All right, so we're going to talk about the minimum spatial data required to support the next-gen functions in an I3 architecture, and those next-gen functions being the ECRF and LVS that Drew just spoke about. So here we're going to see that our critical next-gen 911 data sets are your PSAP boundaries, your road center lines, emergency service or responder boundaries, address points, and provisioning boundaries. And for each of these required data sets, we do have things to consider. So in next-gen, we've got 3 new stakeholders. The primary stakeholder in legacy or E911 are the telco providers, because they're housing the alley, and the responsibility comes back to them to have an updated alley, which indicates effectively an address point. But with next-gen, the stakeholders are now going to be the local 911 authority, or the PSAP, your addressing authorities, and the GIS data providers. So this is a new party. We've got new people who are stakeholders, meaning they're responsible for the completeness and accuracy of all of the data that is feeding the 911 systems. So think about this for a moment. Some of you are already working together with some or all of the other stakeholders, and some of you probably aren't. And that's okay, because a collaboration on this level hasn't necessarily been vital until now. So establishing these relationships, that's key. And don't be afraid to be the one to start the conversations. So for all of your critical data sets, we need to consider what source, which stakeholder is this information coming from. All right, we also, for each data set, need to think about the footprint. Every PSAP's data footprint is vital. Each PSAP needs a working relationship with every other PSAP they share a boundary with, because next-gen is moving us toward aggregated data sets that require sharing data across borders. Right now in many PSAPs, their data set, and it's great if you go in and if you haven't sat in at your local PSAP when it's safe to do so, I encourage you all to spend some time at your PSAP and really understand what your GIS data is literally looking like and how it's being handled in the PSAP. It's going to really help fill this picture for you. So if you go into a PSAP, most PSAPs, if they've got a map display, their map literally ends at the PSAP border. Maybe they'll have a small buffer for data in other PSAPs around, in terms of the data. Maybe they'll have talked with their other PSAPs and have maybe a 10, sometimes even maybe a 30-mile buffer, but the map still ends. And that's not enough. Next-gen demands maps without borders. There are also new update turnaround requirements for GIS, and that's the errors and discrepancies that Drew was just talking about. These discrepancies that are reported from the PSAP in a fully functioning next-gen 911 system, those discrepancies need to be resolved within a 3-business-day cycle. So that's going to require coordinating and communicating with the other organizations that might be helping to provide this data, going back to those sources and the stakeholders. And finally, each source entity, so the 911 authority, the local addressing authority, the GIS data provider, each source entity is responsible for the accuracy, and that's both in the spatial accuracy and the attribution of each data set. So this is going to, again, bring up a situation where you have to coordinate. And you're going to have to coordinate with your other stakeholders and possibly all of those stakeholders in your neighboring PSAPs as well. All right, so the first NENA required data set, and really actually it's in no particular order, but I'm kind of building from the ground up. Let's talk about briefly the road center lines. So I'm sure you all are familiar with your road center lines, but one of the biggest things to think about for your road center lines is that they're edge matched. And what does that mean? edge matching with your neighboring jurisdictions. This means that you are making sure that your data, when your data is pushed against your neighbor's data, that your center lines break at the PSAP boundary lines, that they don't overlap each other, that there are no gaps, and for sure you don't want any duplicate center lines. You're going to want to look for consistent naming conventions, literally how are street names named, and we're going to get into those components later on in this conversation. And if you trust your MSAG, synchronizing it with your GIS data will help you look for fallout or discrepancies between those two sources before it even comes into play at the PSAP. All right, the next required data set, address points. They, of course, provide the most precise call and resource routing when we have an actual structure point. And they're verifiable. We can drive down the road and see them. So that's fantastic. SubAddressing is key. We're going to get into SubAddressing as well later on when we get into the weeds. But you always want to have SubAddress information where you have non-addressed, where you have actual subaddresses, so units, suites, shopping malls, what have you. Again, we'll talk about that. But your address points should also include your non-addressed but dispatchable locations. And this is the commonplace layer that I spoke about a little bit ago. So think about what your callers might use that are going to help your call takers know precisely where they are. And put yourself literally, I used to, when I worked with the data for past clients, I would literally imagine I'm a caller standing somewhere, what's coming out of my mouth in my panic situation? And then I would try to reverse engineer from a GIS analyst standpoint, what do I need to build into my data that can help bridge that communication between this person who's in an emergency and is not a GIS person and is not a call taker most likely? How do I bridge the communication between the two with the data I'm providing? And of course, synchronizing your data, your GIS data with your ALI will add another point of, another level of point verification. Real fast, a little bit about subaddressing right now. So of course, we're talking about multi-unit structures, and we've got some examples of what might be some multi-unit structures, and we can see here on the map too, what it looks like when you have multi-unit structures but no sub-addressing data. You see they all have the same address. So multi-unit structures often share a common mailing address, but they can have separate dispatchable locations. And think of this, if you have one building taking up an entire city block, you could have separate locations literally a block away from each other, but all with the same address. And that can be a nightmare for responders. And there are a variety of ways to approach your sub-addressing. I'm actually not going to get into those specific methodologies in this workshop. If you do have questions about that, we'd be happy to talk with you about that offline. But what I do want to emphasize today is that the NENA schema provides fields to contain your sub-addressing values. And populating those values correctly will prevent duplicate addresses from appearing in your data, and that's going to differentiate your locations. Duplicate address points means ambiguous call routing, and that can delay getting help to the callers. I see that we've got a question, and I am happy to take that.
All right, so actually I have two of them. Well, one of them might be still in development. The one that I do have is from Mark at 140 saying, errors must be resolved in 3 business days. What if the only GIS person is on vacation? Any recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is something we're going to talk about a little bit, and really understanding the GIS environment that you're currently operating in. So knowing that 3 business days is out there, something I might look into is training someone up to maybe take on that role if for some reason I'm out of pocket or if I'm out of the office for a certain amount of time to address those issues. One thing that I think we can identify is it's going to be hard to police or enforce that 3 business day requirement. So don't feel, so I've got to contradict myself here in a minute, so just please bear with me. Don't feel like that's something that you need to stick to, but because it is written, because it is a standard, where it can get you into trouble is if you're on vacation and someone's not trained up, or you don't have the ability to make those corrections within that 3 business day time frame. Should a call come in for a location that requires correcting, and outside of that 3 business day window, another call comes in from the same location and you have the same call routing issue or delayed response, and you can identify that it's due to an issue with the call routing because that data hasn't been corrected, that potentially will cause you some problems that are avoidable. So it's the things to think about are, you have the ability to augment staff resources? Can you train someone up? Or can you work with a vendor or identify a partner that can help offload some of that from you in case you're out of pocket? That would be my suggestion.
Excellent.
Thank you,
I can throw yes, thank you. So the next question that I have comes from Dave at 145, asking, in rural areas, should an address point be placed at the access point or on the structure?
Oh, that's such a
great
good
question. I love it.
I'm curious to hear what Drew says. And the reason I say that is because there are a lot of different ways to approach this. And this is when it comes down to the collaboration among all of your stakeholders. Because in a rural situation, of course, you might have a really long driveway, and the structure might physically land in one PSAP, but the access lands in another. So this is where it's so important to literally sit down with each other and sit down with the GIS data and work these things out. I'm not sure that there's a right or a wrong way to do this. It's really going to depend on how all of your agencies work together. Drew, how would you answer that question?
You're exactly right, Sarah. There's no really right or wrong. The best practice is going to be have the address points at center of structure, and then support that information with an ingress egress point that is at the property entrance for long driveways, or if the entrance is behind the house, right? So there are some different thoughts of practice there. The one thing to consider is consistency. So pick whatever method is going to work best for your process, and stick to it throughout the entire data set, right? So if the decision is made to put the address point at the front door, be consistent through the entire database. If it's going to be, I probably wouldn't suggest having the address point sit at the ingress or egress point of the property. I would augment that with an ingress egress point that is a part of another data layer, or is even a part of your addressing layer. Because what you want to be able to identify on the map is the actual location of the structure. And if the point is at the ingress egress, it's not really going to define where that building is without using supplementary information like building polygon layer or imagery. And if you're able to maintain imagery relatively recurring and updated, that's helpful. But for some localities, it's hard to identify the age or the accuracy of imagery, and that could create problems. So best practice is point sitting on center of structure. It is not a standard, but whatever you decide to go with, be consistent.
Awesome. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And we're caught up.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your questions. Please do keep them coming because, again, we want to have this be as interactive as we can. All right, so that's sub-addressing. Let's move on to the PSAP boundary. So, of course, your primary PSAP is a required data set to have that boundary because that is the area that the PSAP is responsible for. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, you also need a footprint of every primary PSAP that you share a boundary with. And there can be special cases for this that you might have to take into account, like federal lands or tribal lands or military bases. So if you haven't made agreements yet regarding these boundaries with your neighbors, now is definitely the time. Again, don't be afraid to be the one to reach out to your neighbor. Don't be afraid to start these conversations. Not everybody is aware of exactly how the next gen changes are impacting everybody. But as a GIS provider, you are a bona fide stakeholder in 911 now. So it's totally appropriate for you to generate this. And of course, when it comes to polygons, you're going to want no gaps, overlaps, or redundant polygons. All right, the provisioning boundary. So the provisioning boundary is a new concept. So don't worry if you're not familiar with it. The provisioning boundary is fairly simple. It defines the GIS data provider provisioning boundary. So everything within your provisioning boundary is the data that you are responsible for. And it also acts as a geofence in the spatial interface. So this comes into play when determining who's responsible for what data in the shared boundary areas. All right, so emergency service boundary layers, and these are not your ESZ layers. Drew's going to get more into this discussion in just a moment. But real briefly here, in your next gen GIS data, each responder type needs its own layer, and this might require collaborating with those particular response agencies. So if you have a separate layer, each for fire and police and EMS, especially if EMS is a third service, for example, within your law enforcement layer, you're going to want to be able to reflect all the different agencies identified. And you might end up building boundaries that align with center lines and address points. Some places actually define their boundaries based on parcels or easements. Again, there's a conversation to be had because it really depends on literally the lay of your land and how your agencies like to operate and different policies they already have in place. But it's a conversation that warrants sitting down with the map, with the data. And of course, again, with polygon boundaries, we're not going to want any gaps or overlaps. So Drew, I'm going to hand it back to you for a few slides to talk about the whole ESN, ESZ, ESB.
Absolutely, I'm happy to. And then, so guys, we're gonna drill through this real quick, and then we have a question to address at the end of this, pertaining to a previous slide. So I want you guys to hold me accountable. All right, so ESNs and ESZs and ESBs, right? That's a whole lot of acronyms, and the one that's kind of new to the game is the emergency service boundary. While new to the game, it's not something that is an alien concept to us, right? Most of us are used to seeing the emergency service number, right? I showed that to you earlier in our MSAG and our ALI, which is that unique identifier that's identifying which PSAP is going to get the call and what services to send out. It's important to know that that can usually be affected by telco boundaries, right? And it's tabular, so it's not spatial, right? It's just a unique, quote unquote, unique number that is identifying a PSAP area and what services are provided should a call come from within that ESN. Well, there were attempts to really make that spatialized, and I'm going to make up a word there. And we have our ESZ, or emergency service zone. That is the geographic extent of that ESN, right? So what's that area that ESN covers, right? It's going to relate to the PSAP boundary, the responding law enforcement agency, the responding fire agency, and what EMS units to send out. right? So the ESG is that visualization of an ESN. So most of us in local government GIS are used to seeing an ESN or an ESZ layer, right? It's that one layer that's a polygon layer where we identify areas for our PSAP as well as our responding agencies, right? Kind of within that one polygon. Well, this is where GIS is going through a transition and is really going to require some work on the GIS professionals at the local level, right? So if we click over to the next slide, I'm going to show you kind of what this looks like now, right? Which is these large polygons covering large areas that are really showing the same information, right? What fire and law enforcement service, or what fire and EMS, or any combination of any three of those responding agencies are responding to this area, right? So to break that down a little further, here's what that looks like. No, that's okay. Go to the next slide. Here's what that looks like in our localized GIS, right? I have my Allentown province or town or municipal boundary. It's going to be ESN 185, and I know I'm sending Allentown Fire, Allentown Police, and Allentown EMS, and it's this primary PSAPs area, right? One polygon is telling me all of that information. Here's the change, right? So if you'll click to the next slide for me, Sarah. This is the change. We're now going from one polygon to multiple polygon layers. So from one polygon layer, that ESN or that ESZ layer that's in our GIS, to our ESB, our emergency service boundary layer, right? And in that, we're going to have 4 ESB layers. Our primary PSAT boundary, which we've already talked about, and Sarah shared with you some great information about that. New is our EMS boundary, our fire boundary, and our law enforcement boundary, right? So you're going to have a layer that is your fire ESB. And in that layer, you're going to have a polygon that's representative of each first due unit area, right? So if you are a locality with one fire service, that's one polygon for your fire. Now, if you're in a more denser area or you have multiple fire agencies that respond to different areas, you're still going to have that one layer, and you're going to have a polygon representing each engine company and their primary response area. Now, keep in mind, between two engine companies' areas, those polygons have to be coincident. You can't have any gaps or any overlaps, right? Because it's going to disrupt service. The same with your law enforcement and the same with your EMS. Now, keep in mind, you may have some areas in your county where you're not the first responding unit because it's an area that's only accessible from a neighboring jurisdiction. If that's the case, you'll see where you start kind of cookie cuttering your ESB boundary to either incorporate an area or to not incorporate it. And this is where you're really going to want to have those solid conversations with your neighbors, because if you're not covering it, they are, based on your mutual aid agreements that you have, right? So the real distinct difference here is your emergency service boundary layer does not have to match provisioning boundary or your PSAT boundary, right? Because we're specifically looking at areas that we're primarily responsible for sending a first due unit to, whether it's in our county or the neighboring county. Typically, you'll see this where you have subdivisions that sit really close to a boundary, a county boundary, and it's faster, or there's been established mutual aid that your engine company one is going to respond to that if a call comes from there. But it's in your neighboring county. So your ESB will cover that. So when that caller calls from there, we're going to go through our call routing process, right? We're going to validate the location. We're going to identify where to send that call based on our PSAP boundary. So we know it's going to go to the county who's incorporating that PSAP, but then they're going to see that the first responding unit based on ESB is the neighboring county. And in our next gen environment, they're going to be able to transfer that call along with data to the neighboring PSAP with the information, this is a fire response. Our MOU says that you're responsible for sending first dibs. So one, you can see how complex and just convoluted this can be when we look at the entire process as it would work in real time. But hopefully you're starting to see the importance of having those conversations and building accurate data sets to support these processes. This is a conversation that I like to spend a lot of time on because on the surface it looks easy, right? So you're going to take your emergency service zone or your ESN layer, you're going to collapse it out into 3 different polygon layers, one for fire, one for EMS, and one for law enforcement. That's great. Now you're going to match that with your neighbors to make sure that it makes sense. And where you need, like your PSAP boundary, you need to document where you're making decisions and why. Some of the decisions have already been made because you have existing MOUs, right? That's great. If you already have those, that's going to make this conversation a lot easier. But you may identify areas where you need to establish new MOUs, right? So it's also important to mention, this is not a GIS issue. The creation of this layer as a 911 authority or a PSAP director, you can't just call your GIS guy and say, hey, go create my ESB. Because we really can't do that. We need input from the public safety community to ensure the decisions we're making are the correct decisions. And having not been a part of the fire service where I'm currently working or part of the police department or EMS, it's going to be hard for me to make those decisions. So we want to get our GIS folks to the table. We want our public safety folks at the table so that the decisions we're making are good decisions and they're accurate decisions. Now, the good thing here is once you've gone through all this work creating these boundary layers, you typically will not have to readdress them, like redo them, for a while. These are decisions that once they get made, they kind of stick, right? So take the time, get the right people to the table, make sure you're making good, accurate decisions that are documented, and just kind of maintain it as you move forward. Now, if you start annexing places, you're going to have to make some changes, but these are typically layers that aren't going to change much over the years. All right, so I know that was a ton of information for you guys on this data. I know we have some questions. So Colton, why don't we get those questions?
All right, so the one question that I do have is from Art back at 151. So this kind of ties back to our last round of questions. We have structures on islands and we put a point on the island and the mainland axis. Does this pose a problem?
It does not. Hopefully you're identifying that ingress egress point as such and not as a structure point, and your structure point is identified as the structure location. My question back to you would be, are those points sitting in the same data set? Or do you have a structure address data set that has a point for the structure and then a separate data layer that is identifying egress ingress? Right, because we know in our NG9 system, we can support additional addressing data sets like ingress egress or our common places. So I think that would be my one question is, do the points sit in the same data set? And if they do, that's fine, as long as you have a descriptor identifying one as the structure location and one is the ingress egress for that structure.
And Art responded that it's the same data set in his case.
Okay, so that's fine as long as you have a way to distinguish between the two, right? You have a description field. A best practice would be to pull that ingress egress point out of your structure addressing layer and use it as a supplementary layer to provide additional information about the location. That workflow is supported in an next-gen environment, so that may be something that you want to think about.
Yes, and I wanted to add too, because in a way, this is somewhat similar to a long driveway situation. The difference potentially is that maybe ingress egress point services more than one structure if you have more than one structure on that island. So Art, glad that you're on the call. Nice to air quotes hear from you. All right, let's move. Are there any more questions, or should we go ahead and move forward? I'm keeping an eye on the time here to make sure we keep things moving.
I just got an FYI, not a question from Peter, and I'm just going to read off what he says verbatim and let you both get moving because I'm aware time is getting a little short. Peter, who's in Eau Claire County, has address points at ingress, egress, and a second feature class as structure points. We have driveways over a mile long in Eau Claire County's case. Again, just an FYI, not a question.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
yeah,
perfect. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think as long as you have a descriptor for each point, one is a structure and one is ingress, egress, I think you're fine.
Mm-hmm. Great discussion. These are all really important. No pun intended, these are all really important points. All right, so those were the required data sets that NENA requires. And having your data sets and schema set up properly are definitely one thing. Populating the values correctly inside these data sets is another, not only within each data set, but also for the relationships between your data sets. So now we're going to get into making sure your data is correct and complete. So we're going to talk, actually Drew's going to talk about the GIS data sources and data providers and understanding where your data comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, this is a topic that I really enjoy talking about because it's something that I don't think we think about often, right? Our data sources and our data providers. So the first big question is, do you know where your GIS data comes from, right? Are you pulling it from planning, from Parks and Rec? Is everything housed and managed and kind of quote unquote owned at GIS? Or are you pulling data layers that are provided by the state? These are significant questions to ask, right? Especially now that we know the required data sets to support the functionality for NG911. And where that comes into play is when we start thinking about authoritative data sets, right? And we think about ownership and stewardship. So if you'll click to the next slide for me, Sarah. Perfect segue, right? So identifying where my data comes from and identifying the level of engagement I have with the data is really going to determine how a lot of things work, right? So am I the data owner, right? If I'm in a GIS office and I own the data, meaning I'm the responsible party for updating those data sets, ensuring the accuracy of them, processing data comparisons or running different types of analysis against the data to ensure that accuracy, right? I know that if something is identified at the PSAP level as an anomaly or an error, they come to me to correct it, and I can fall within that 3-day time frame, right? That 3 business day period that we just talked about. So I can execute that turnaround very quickly because I control the data. I'm that data owner. But if it's a data set that I am a steward of, meaning I get a copy once a year from the state, I get a copy once a quarter from Parks and Rec, that's really going to alter the way and affect that 3-day turnaround when an issue comes in related to that data set, right? Because I'm not the expert in charge of the data, ensuring that data quality and the data accuracy. I have to rely on somebody else for that. So I have to bring them into this conversation early, right? maybe I don't want to be the owner, and that's okay, right? It's an addressing layer, it's a parcel layer. Maybe it's something that you're getting from natural resources at the state level, right? Something related to trails, trailheads, and trail ends. It's great information. You don't want to be responsible for ensuring the accuracy and management of that data. But you need to know what data sets you have that fall within that stewardship category so that you can bring them to this NG911 conversation early, right? Inform them and educate them of that 3 business day turnaround time frame and establish a workflow that is going to ensure when an anomaly comes in on one of those borrowed, quote unquote, borrowed data layers, that you know the proper channels to push it through to get it corrected and back to you and into 911 within that 3 business day time frame, right? So this is extremely important when we, take the context away of really just using GIS for land management and putting it into this mission critical role of supporting 911. Really understanding these 2 roles is going to carry you a long way, right? All right, so let's change the conversation a little bit, right? Let's go to open source data, right? So I may not necessarily know who the owner is because I'm in ArcGIS Online and I pull down a data layer for PSAT boundaries or for roads, probably from the state. It's probably a state layer that was put into an open data source format. So things to think about if you're going to do that or if you're currently doing that. Is it authoritative, right? So a reputable agency was responsible for uploading that data to ArcGIS Online or to an open data platform. It wasn't a hobbyist like me who uses OpenStreetMap to track, anything that's, traversable by foot in my locality, right? It's not that it's bad information, it's just not authoritative. I need it to be authoritative. I need to know the update schedule of it so that I can work that into my workflow for keeping my data up to date. What data type is it? If I'm pulling it down, is it a feature layer or a feature service, right? I can save a feature layer out locally and I can now take ownership of that at some level. If it's a feature service, I can't edit the data at all. I pull down a copy, right? And that really all relates to data edit. Am I able to edit the data? Right? This next slide, this is my favorite slide in the entire deck, right? Because again, like needing to answer the questions of data owner or data steward or is it authoritative, I have to follow those questions up with this. Is the data available, right? And is all of the necessary data there, right? So is it a complete data set? Everything that I need to support whatever functionality is required or requested of me, I have all of that information. And that's really important when we think about Next Gen 911, because if we're the data owner of a road center line layer or an address point layer, or we're pulling copies of that over from a planning department or from a state agency, I need to know that I have a complete attribute table to support the functionality I need, like a state field or a county field, right? Or is my data parsed? And we're going to talk about that a little more in detail here in a little bit, but these are questions you should be asking. So does the data reflect the real world? And is it consistent, right? This easily goes back to does all of your address points sit on center of structure? Are they all at front door? Are they all at ingress egress, right? So is it reflective of the real world currently? Right? We don't want to use a data set that's 5 years old because we know that's not reflective of the real world. We want to use the most current data set that we can get our hands on, or if we're managing it, we make sure that we keep it as up to date as possible. Is the data available when I need it? So if I'm pulling down that feature service or that feature layer, if I need to go out and get a new copy of it once a quarter, once a week, or once a year, depending on the data type, has it been updated, right? Has that service been taken away? Does it go down? I love the question that we had earlier related to, what if I'm the only one that knows how to do this and I'm out of pocket for a little bit? Or the people that need data, do you have a workflow set up, or do you have the capability for them to go grab it even if you're not in the office? And then we want to check the consistency between the data systems, right? State plane versus WGS 84. Do we have duplicate records? So again, these are questions that you should be asking yourself as you start into this NG911 conversation, and now that you know the required data sets and a little more information, right? This next slide is great. Shapefile versus geodatabase, age-old question. Neither one of these is right, neither one is wrong for NG911. It will support both. The benefits to a geodatabase is it gives you a little more flexibility with what you're able to do with the data. It also is a compressed format, so it takes up less space on your hard drives or your servers. If you are used to operating in a shapefile, that's great. Start doing some research into the benefits of using a geodatabase, especially as you start talking about next generation 911. With a geodatabase and a certain Esri license level, you're able to run topology checks or set topology up. It's going to help you keep your data correct. It's the topology that you can set up in Esri doesn't address everything it needs to address for next gen, but it's a good start. I like shapefiles. I grew up learning shapefile. I like shapefile organization better, but there are some limitations. The files are bigger. You have a tendency to duplicate those more, which can, force you to lose track on which one is current. So if you have really good workflow and a really good way to maintain currency and accuracy of those shapefiles, then do whatever's comfortable for you. I will encourage you to look into geodatabase and stuff if you have that capability. All right, data schema. This is great. So we referred you to the NG911 data model. How is that going to affect you with your local data schema? Some folks may choose to, switch over and incorporate the NG911 data model as their schema, and that's great. But you want to consider the existing business systems that you're currently operating off of your local data schema. So you don't want to break a system, right? We also know that there are some limitations that CAD. Some CAD systems will only support a street type of 2 characters, not 3 or not 8. Right? So think about integrating components of the NG911 data model into your existing local data model so that you don't break anything. Because you can always add to the schema. What's hard to identify is whether or not a change that you implemented broke a system. Right? Requires a little more effort to that. So give thoughtful consideration to the mandatory, the conditional, the optional data fields that are identified in that data model. Everything that's mandatory is exactly that. It's mandatory. It's required. There are also some rules around conditional and optional. It's really going to speak to, while it's not required, if you have the information to support that field, then use it because it's only going to make it better. And I really like to talk about different coordinate systems, such as state plane and WGS 84, because we know most of our data sets are stored in a state plane coordinate system. With WGS 84, NG911 requires your data set to be in WGS 84. So how do you do that? One good thing to know is that when you push your data into the spatial interface, it's going to automatically convert your data from state plane to WGS 84. So that means you don't necessarily have to keep multiple copies of your database locally, one in state plane and one in WGS 84 to support migration to NG911. But you should know that conversion happens outside of your controlled environment. Right? So these are things you can start working on now and conversations you can start having. What's going to be a best practice for you in regards to data model, how to incorporate components of the next-gen data model into your existing data schema, and state plane versus WGS84. I will tell you that there are vendors in the market, and I'm happy to provide you a list of products that exist that will automatically do those conversions for you in a more controlled environment outside of the spatial interface to give you an idea of that adjustment, right? So how does the data change? How does it move when you go from state plane to WGS84? If you've worked so hard to build this consistent data set in state plane, you want to see what's going to happen when you change it so that you know what to expect on the back end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Drew. We are going to keep this moving into a poll now. And if we can go ahead and launch that poll, do you know what systems are currently supported using your GIS data? Yes or no? So love to hear from all of you. And it sounds like we have one question maybe that we could answer while we're collecting our responses.
You bet. So Joseph asks, for larger malls, are entrance points recommended as well as internal inside stores?
I would say yes. What do you think, Drew?
Let me go read that question.
While Drew's reading it, I'll speak to one of the major airports that I worked with a couple of years ago. They literally had they had data elements right down to the sinks and stalls inside their bathrooms, in every concourse, in the terminal. They had everything, and they had codes relating to every single one of those locations. And because they're an airport, they work they have their own public safety system just for the airport. And I'll tell you, it ran real smoothly. That's just my experience. Drew, what do you, now that you've read it, or did you get to read it?
Yeah. So I'll address this really quickly, and I apologize, guys. I've been pretty long-winded on some of this, and I want to make sure that we're sticking to our timetables, or if we go over, it's just a little bit. It's okay to do that if you want. Keep in mind that you're responsible for managing that. So if there are changes at such a granular level, you're responsible for ensuring that that information gets updated. And you want to ensure the continuance of that level of granularity focus, whether you're in the office or you're out, or in a transition phase. If you're of retirement age, you want to make sure that someone knows how to maintain that data at that high level, even after you retire, or you just come back and work part-time and do that. So yeah, it's okay. And NextGen will support that. And you'll see that in the data model that you can get that granular. It's keeping it managed and updated can be the issue.
Agreed. Awesome. How are our responses?
I'll close the poll now and show off those responses. We heard back from just over half of our attendees for this.
That's great. That's really good. So this is just a huge part that the vast majority of you already have a good hold on. So you've got the information that you need to go out and determine what changes might break other people's systems. So that's fantastic. All right, thank you all for responding. It really helps us move through, especially when we can't see you and interact with you in person. We're going to move into, we're starting to get into the weeds here a little bit. What's the purpose of the 98% in your data preparedness? So, Drew, what do you have to say about this? And we do have a poll right after this slide as well.
All right. So, yeah, 98%. If you've been a part of the NextGen 911 conversation for a while, you've heard this 98%. So what does that mean, and where does it come from? Right, so it comes from this document that NENA published back in 2009. It's an informational document for E911 that's really addressing synchronizing your GIS data with your MSAG and ALI that you should maintain a 98% synchronization rate between GIS, MSAG, and ALI to support CAD mapping, right? So, you know, it's a good start, but it's not enough because it's really only looking at that I2 architecture, which was E911, and it's not enough to support next-gen 911, right? This number gets thrown around a lot and has been kind of a measure of success for some places, you know, where they're taking on this, all right, once I get to 98%, I'm good to go, right? My data's been synchronized. Let's go. Let's move towards next-gen 911. It's just not enough, right? And I'm going to explain to you after our poll why it's not enough.
Perfect. All right, let's move to the poll. What do you think the 98% is? We've got, go ahead and select one. I know we have a lot of different choices here, but is it the data synchronization between your GIS and MSAG? Maybe between your GIS and ALI? Your tabular data comparison? Hey, my data is at 98% accuracy, I'm good? Or is it a measure of the accuracy of your spatial data? What's your favorite pick there?
And I've got another question for you, Sarah and Drew, if you want to take it now.
Yeah, please.
Sure.
Awesome. Joseph asks back at 222, in the future, do you see the coordinate systems updated to NRS 2022 or based on the new federal coordinate standards?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't even know if that's been addressed yet, to be honest. That is a great question, and I think that is something that we should take back to our team to see if anybody that sits on some of the NENA working groups has got some clarity on. I do not, unfortunately.
I don't either. Great question. Thank you. How are we doing on the poll? Yeah.
So right now I've heard back from 48% of our responders. So I think we can go ahead and close it and go over the results.
Alrighty.
There you go.
Hey, this is pretty good.
It is good.
All right.
All right, so you know, we're seeing a mixed bag of answers between 98% is data synchronization between GIS and MSAG, 98 is data synchronization between GIS and ALI. It's just a tabular data comparison, as if my data is at 98%, I'm good to go. These are typically the responses that we see. I don't know if you guys are able to see the results, but it's floating a little down the middle between ready to go and is a measure of accuracy of my data. Sarah, let's get into a little more detail about this 98%, what's really going to help folks really kind of address that meaning a little better.
Absolutely. Yeah. Should be good to go.
All right, excuse me. All right, so at 98%, synchronization, that does not produce NG911 ready GIS data, right? When we think about it being built for E911 and an I2 architecture, not for next gen, it's a great place to start and it's something good to shoot for, right? But we want to figure out how to move past 98%, right? We want to develop data towards the I3 architecture. We want to look at it. We really want to look at the quality of our data beyond synchronization. And when I say synchronization and beyond synchronization, we want to look past just tabular data comparisons and synchronization. We want to make sure our data is spatially accurate as well, right? And we want to, you know, we have those new layers to develop. We want to think about a regionalized data governance and management, because if we look at the purpose of Next-Gen 911, it's to create that bigger network and infrastructure that allows us to transfer calls between PSAPs, right? But we need to know that the data accuracy that we're transferring to matches ours at least, right? And we want to look at error resolution, right? We already discussed the 3 business days, but you know, and I want to show you and give you some things to think about of what it means for you. It's also worth pointing out that if you'll go back up for a second for me, I do want to read that asterisk line because I think it's important. Is that 98% number that came from that informational document 71501 does not address the completeness of your GIS data that's required for NG911. So that's why it doesn't create or produce NG911 ready GIS data. Right? So what does this mean for you? Well, it's really going to force you to look at your staffing patterns, right? If you operate GIS as a secondary role, are you able to address the needs, that 3 business day turnaround? Are you a single GIS person? And you have all of these responsibilities currently, and now we're going to throw on this data accuracy and data synchronization. You may want to think about augmenting staff a little bit or adding additional resources. Do you outsource your GIS because you don't have GIS locally? Well, maybe you use a vendor. That's fine, and that's great. You need to bring your vendor to the table and get them on board. Because if they're managing your data, again, you need that workflow and that process that's going to allow you to submit that data change and have that quick turnaround. And if you're an enterprise GIS department and you have different people responsible for different data sets as a product owner or editor, make sure they're communicating with each other on those changes and that they're sharing information with each other, right? So how you staff your GIS department is really going to determine your best path forward for meeting that 98% and beyond synchronization. I have a break right here, Sarah. Are you just, okay, sorry guys, I was reading a message from Sarah and I thought we had a question come in and we don't. All right, so let's look at pushing beyond 98%, right? So if we're not at 98% and if we're at 98% and we just feel like we can't put past it because that's our measure of success, we know that we're going to have some difficulties in verifying location, right? Because 2% of our data hasn't been matched the way it needs to be to support that accurate call routing process. Right, 2% of our data. And we know the expectations of people that are calling 911 are the same regardless of where they fall in that 98% range, right? So we need to make sure that we're trying to produce the most complete and accurate public safety grade GIS data we can. And the only way we can do that is by pushing beyond 98%. I'm going to say it again. Use 98% as a measure to start from and get there, but then figure out how you can push past it, right? So some ways you can push past that are validating and synchronizing your PSAP boundaries, internal to your locality as well as external with your neighbors. Identify areas of the road center line that are missing breaks, right? NENA states that road center lines have to be broken at PSAP boundary changes, at PSAP boundaries. So think about snap 2 points. Have you incorporated snap 2 points in your data set as a part of your editing workflow? Right. You can also get into doing some more in-depth spatial data comparisons using a fishbowl analysis. I know there's some processes out there on the web that Esri put out that identifies how to create these fishbowls. There are also vendors in the market that do this for you or provide you the ability and the tools to do this without you having to program anything or having to have a certain license level to do it. This is an example of a fishbowl, right? So a fishbowl is going to compare the placed address point, right, representative of your structure, to where it would geocode on the road center line. And we want to see something that's relatively 90 degrees. So look at the center of the screen there, where you see good spacing, right? It looks good. And then you see this call out where things are kind of skewing to one side or the other. We can immediately identify a potential issue there. And if we were to investigate further, we would see that we probably have an address range that is very large, right? So it's too big for the road that we have. because it's more theoretical than real. So fishbones are really going to help you get to that decision-making process of, are we using real or theoretical road ranges? And can we identify areas where we can tighten things up to get fishbones that look like this new call-out box, where things are relatively perpendicular to the road and are quickly identifying where we have data that's crossing over. Right? So fishbones are that great visual, that quick visual representation of, hey, the data looks really solid, or I can immediately see some issues that I need to go and address. So our next slide is a poll, and I'm actually going to suggest that we just kind of skip over it due to time constraints. Sarah?
Sure, no problem. We can. Yeah, okay. We can do it. Yeah.
We can take. Okay. Sorry, Sarah.
Yeah. No worries. Nope. Whoops. I just hit the wrong button. Okay, let's move in. So we're going to talk about establishing an order of operations, and that is knowing where to start and really getting into the weeds, because when it comes to achieving data preparedness, the entire process can look really overwhelming. So hopefully we can break this down for you into more manageable pieces. So with next-gen data, GIS data, it's really tempting to rush into validating your data. And me personally, I love measuring things and knowing how far along I am in a project. So running validations gives me that feeling of satisfaction along with a metric, and that just makes me really happy. With GIS data for next gen, there are so many factors that we have to take into consideration before we run the validations. And it's these factors and remediation that might take months to accomplish. And of course, it won't hurt anything to run validations, but we can't lose sight of the necessary work that needs to happen to achieve the accuracy and completeness that Drew was just talking about. So getting your data prepared and complete for next gen depends on a strategy or an order of operations that will encompass your required data layers, your parsing, your addressing conventions, data schema, and wait for it, yes, validations. So let's talk about the required data layers and parsing. And by now, we're pretty familiar with the required data layers that are shown here on the right. So parsing your road center lines and address points attributes are a whole other story. And this takes us way back to the beginning of this workshop, where we were talking about the GIS data model and the CLDXF document. So I'm pretty sure you all know what parsing is, but just to be sure, parsing is analyzing a string of symbols, either in natural language, computer language, or in data structures, to ensure that the information conforms to the rules of the formal grammar of that language. It's analyzing the syntax of the entire sentence or data statement. And in our case, that's the full street name for a road center line, or the full address for an address point. So to break down and categorize each element in that data statement. Road center line and address point parsing for NextGen is based on the Civic Location Data Exchange Format, or the CLDXF standard. When we parse our road center lines and address points, we break the full names and addresses into common components like you see here. We can see that we've got an address number, we have the full name, which is the concatenated elements or components, and then we have the parsed out name, parsed out type. We have a field for our post direction or suffix direction and our post modifier. This particular data doesn't have values for that, but those fields are there. And we can even look to the right and we can see a subname, which is a address number suffix. So this is parsing. Let's take a few minutes to look at the actual elements for the major components that we need to concern ourselves with. So these are the 8 street name elements in the CLDXF standard, and these are applicable to the street names in both your road center lines and in your address points. And this is where you can give consideration to how you integrate the NextGen 911 data model into your existing schema. These 8 fields are required, and you'll recognize 4 of them in here do come from legacy, but we have new modifiers and pre-type separators that we now need to take into consideration. So the schema that the state of Wisconsin is in the process of developing will almost certainly incorporate the schema. And if you're using Esri's local government data model, they're probably already in your data. But if you don't use that model, and if you haven't added these fields to your data, you're going to need to do that. And you should probably read the NextGen 911 data model and CLDXF documents. They're both excellent cures for insomnia. But in all seriousness, think of how you can integrate these components into your data without breaking anyone else's system that uses your data. What do you need to maintain? Maybe you'll need to maintain your legacy fields as well as your I3 fields so you could still accommodate other systems. So I'm not going to take time to step through these. You've probably been reading these examples, but one thing I am going to point out is a lot of people get hung up on this whole concept of the pre and post modifier and in parsing out modifiers that might exist in your data. So think of it this way. A modifier is an adjective. So alternate root 8 as your pre-modifier. Alternate is describing the root. So thinking of modifiers in that way can help figure out how you need to parse. Okay, we have 4 address number elements now, no longer just an address number. Now we have a prefix and a suffix, and you may or may not actually have prefixes and suffixes in your data. Something that I think is really cool is the fact that you can optionally use a milepost, either in place of or in addition to an address number in your address number elements. And that is great, especially useful in rural addressing. So those are the 4 number elements. Now talking about sub-addressing, we do have 6 sub-address elements, and these are different from the address number elements. And if you glance down these, you can see building floor, unit room seat, I like to call these the beefers, and then the additional location information. So we've got our building, which is like building A, additional location information, hey, the West Wing, great TV show. Floor, unit, room, seat, talking about, this is when we think about the malls, we think about the airports. Consider this, if you have a large venue with multiple ingress and egress points, wouldn't it be great to identify every dispatchable location right down to a seat? And would this be a lot of work to put in your data? Definitely. Would you have to collaborate with other organizations to get this data? Most likely. But would it be worth it when it saves someone's life? I think absolutely. So remember, getting your data complete is an ongoing endeavor. Don't think you have to get it all done at once. Okay, so also in our order of operations, we need to think about addressing conventions. So addressing conventions are different ways data can be identified coming from multiple data sources. So think about what's the local standard for addressing. Are the directionals and types? Are they abbreviations or are they written out? Are there numbered streets? And if so, how are those written? You can see here, here's a conflict between our address points, 2nd Street being the number 2 and D, and then the center line, 2nd being written out. This will be a conflict. These data elements do not match each other. So, and do you have address number prefixes or suffixes? How are those determined? How are they written? A lot of these conventions and decisions are driven by other systems. So you're going to want to examine and collate all of these different conventions. Understanding the local standards of how addressing needs to be created. Some places don't have standards, and that's okay, because now is an opportunity to establish your standard from scratch and with all of these public safety elements in mind. If you do have existing standards, you might have to examine and accommodate them by adding other elements to your schema so you can address next-gen needs without breaking those other systems. And either way, having a sound standard helps to push your data forward on a consistent basis. And of course, rubbing your GIS data against your NSAG and ALI can also help to verify the consistency of these addressing conventions. Okay, this is a screenshot actually from the data model. And I know most of you haven't read it, so I'm hoping that this really helps you to start to understand what is in this document. So this is going to be more detail. You're going to find this detailed information about attribute schema for all of your required and recommended layers. But more importantly, you'll have at your fingertips what you need to know about whether a field is mandatory, conditional, or optional. And these documents can get really heady, but they are crucial for your understanding how to manage your data to achieve completeness. So when you do read these documents, keep these things in mind. First, the NENA documents require fields must be in your data and populated when that data component exists. And what do I mean by that? As an example, your county might not use pre-directionals at all. That field would be in your data and it would be empty because that particular component doesn't exist in your street name. But anywhere that a data component does exist, that needs to be reflected in your attributes. Take the state field. Often when we get data from other partners, they don't have certain fields that are mandatory for next gen, like the state field. But for sure, each of your features probably exists in a state, except for Canada and Mexico, and that's a different story and a different conversation. Full interpretation doesn't stop here, though. You need to think about what information is going to ultimately get a responder to a caller, kind of like I described a little while back. If you read through these documents, you'll see that everything that is conditional or optional will actually help you to have a more complete data set. And data completeness, from a pre-validation standpoint, takes all of this into consideration. So think about how flexible you want your data to be and adjust your granularity accordingly. We're always advocates of, if the data's available, parse it out, get it into those fields, whether they're conditional or optional, and certainly if they're mandatory. So just to reinforce these points, when you read any of these documents, identify what's mandatory, conditional, and optional, and really understand your legacy fields. They might continue to be your friends for a very long time, especially if other systems depend on them. And understanding fields that we don't typically maintain, but need to maintain now. Keep in mind that the granularity contributes to flexibility and accuracy, and the hard work really is worth it. None of this work is one and done. So if you're going to choose to go into as high level of detail as you can, your data set will be more flexible and able to serve all the business systems that depend on you. It's one thing to know that you can maintain the granularity, but it's another to understand the process of maintaining it and having the resources to do so. All right, the last pieces to consider before we go to another poll is that in your order of operations for preparing your data, you really want to focus on the existing business operations that your GIS data supports. And we've talked about this a little bit already, but again, determine what might break a system and plan your workflows and schema accordingly. Also, be sure to communicate with other stakeholders to make sure that data updates run smoothly within the required time frame, and that you know might working on the data themselves. All right, go to another poll. My in support next gen 911 functionality. And I know we've got a question, and I understand it sounds like my audio is starting to wobble, so I'm going to let Drew take the question just to make sure everybody can hear his answer. So take it away.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so that next question comes from Mark, who at 2:37 asked, what address ranges do you recommend? Real 101 through 125th or theoretical 101 through 199th?
That's a great question. It's really going to depend on what's going to work best for you locally. What we typically see is a combination of both, where it makes sense, and those fishbones are really going to give you a good indicator of if you have a theoretical range, how close is the theoretical to your real, based on how those fishbones are drawing. Where things begin to look really odd is if you have like 1 to 1,000 on a road that's 100 feet long, right? So there's no right or wrong answer. It's really do what is going to make the most sense. One of the best practices is try and move towards real as much as possible, while completely understanding that in some areas theoretical is just going to work, is what's going to work best.
All right, thanks, Drew. Looks like we've got about half. Oh, I just heard a noise pop in.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about what you were fixing to say. What's going on with the poll?
I was just getting ready to close it and show that up. It's about half of you have responded, and it looks like Sarah has gotten off the line and gotten back on the line, so hopefully her audio is good as well. But let me close that poll and show it off.
Nice. All right, I love it. 13% of you, 13% of you, you're 100% ready to go. You ready to start validating data? We've got about 70% that are at 50% ready, 13% are at 0, and 4% are still wanting to know where to start. Great answers. For those of you that are 100% ready, let's talk. I'd love to know what you've done to get your data where it needs to be. Has self-education? Are you working with other people to get there? It's always a great time for me to learn from what you guys are doing. The same for the 70% of you that are at 50%, right? What have you done that's gotten you to be, about halfway ready to start validating your data? And then if you're at 0%, is there anything that I can do to help you guys get moving in that direction? Do you still have questions? Yeah, these are great conversations, and thank you guys so much for participating in the polls. It's always good to see.
All right, moving back into that slideshow.
All right, there we go. Okay, hopefully my audio is a little bit better, but Drew's going to be talking about data validations now, and where is the value in validating GIS or your 911 data?
Yeah, absolutely. So guys, I'm going to run through these next few slides relatively quick, but I do want to point out from the data model document is this quote. So the NENA NG911 data model document defines the GIS data model, which supports the NENA Next Generation 911 core services of location validation and routing, both geospatial call routing or routing to the appropriate agency for dispatch. So that statement is the value in validating your GIS data, right? Because it just told us what our purpose is, right? Our purpose is geospatial call routing and ensuring that we get that caller to the right agency for dispatch, right? Sarah, if you'll go to the next slide for me. So there's the value in validations, right? But we want to distinguish the difference between CAD validations and NG911 validations. You've also heard us talk a lot about data completeness, right? Really identified throughout that NG911 data model. And when we think about data validations, we're really looking to identify the anomalies in the data, right? So it's not to say that something's right or something's wrong, but something just goes against the rules, right? We know dealing with legacy information mixed with more current information, when trying to synchronize and maintain those data sets, we're going to find some things that are exceptions to the rule, and we just need to take a deeper dive into them and make sure we understand what they mean, right? So let's get into some of these CAD validations versus NG911 validations, right? The purpose of the CAD validation is to ensure that the information that's provided by the caller or the information that comes across our CAD is a locatable address, right? So does the information exist in our MSAG and ALI so that we can dispatch service? That's kind of what a CAD validation is, and it's a post-call decision, right? It's not a pre-call. It's not using GIS. It's making sure the tabular data that exists in our MSAG and ALI is there when we're able to relate it to the information we're getting from a caller. That's what a CAD validation is. And next-gen 911 validation goes beyond just tabular data comparisons where we're comparing our GIS data to our MSAG and our GIS data to our ALI, but we're also wanting to look at the spatial accuracy of those points, lines, and polygons and really take topology into the picture, right? So we've talked about this throughout the entire presentation, but this is where the rubber starts meeting the road. It's when we're able to actually do those validations, right? To build towards either 98% or beyond 98%, and then put a workflow in place. That's hard to say 3 times really fast. That ensures we're able to maintain that level of accuracy, right? So this is what we get, and I'll put this slide in here for the specific purpose of calling out the differences in CAD and next-gen validations, because I don't want you leaving here thinking that you already do data validations because your CAD has that functionality. I want to build onto it a little bit and provide you more information so that you're able to really identify whether or not CAD is meeting that, or if you need to start looking at different validation engines or some different rules to process your data against. All right, and I think we're ready for our next poll. All right, so guys,
We are.
All right,
Go
so
ahead.
what you learned from now, do you see the differences between the next-gen validations and the CAD validations? We'll
And I
let that
think we have a
run.
question too. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, let's go.
all right. So Kim asks, what is the function of the ESN left and right on the center line if NextGen is using the polygon to validate it anyway?
That's a great question. So my question back to you is, as you draw your boundaries, are you going to run your boundary line down the center of that center line? Right? Or are you going to address the ESN boundaries to incorporate property? Right? Not just the center line. It's important to know where those ESN boundaries currently exist, because that's really going to help you start the process of creating the necessary boundaries, the ESB boundary, the PSAP boundary, building towards next-gen 911. Right? So ESN, the number itself is really driven from the telecommunications company, right? We don't really have a big role in that. But you need to know where it is, because that's going to really give you that starting point for creating those boundaries. It is a good point to pull up or identify where you have boundaries that are running down the center of a road, to see if you can't start adjusting that to incorporate both sides of the road to eliminate confusion or miscommunication when dispatching a service. Right. NextGen is going to help fix a lot of that, but that separation of those ESNs is still important, because it's identifying potentially identifying two different participating or two different responding units or PSAPs. Hopefully that helped. All right, Colton, how are we doing on the poll?
Here's some results.
Love it. So 50% of you said yes, you understand the difference. 4 of you are like, no, I still really don't get it. And some of you are like, yeah, I kind of see what's going on. That's fine. That's a great place to be in. It means, we've got to do some more work in making sure that we're articulating correctly to you guys the differences, or, reach out to us directly with your questions so that we can help get you to that, yes, you do understand the differences, or provide you the necessary information that you need.
Excellent. All right. Thank you all for responding, and we'll go back to the slide deck. And Drew, if you want to talk about data completeness.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something as a career GIS guy, I never really thought about data completeness until I started thinking about NextGen 911. We've talked about it off and on throughout the entire presentation. Think in terms of completeness here as it relates to the data model with your mandatory, your conditional, and your optional fields. Also state, county, zip codes, and community values are fields or are attributes that we typically take for granted, just because the nature of local government GIS is functioning and operating within, and I'm going to say a bad word here, within that silo that our data exists, right? So do I need to know that I'm in the state of Virginia because I work here, right? Do I need to know that it's Fauquier County, Virginia, because it's the county that employs me? Yes. It's important to track all of this stuff in your data because now you have to think about sharing your data in a regional or the state effort. And any amount of information that you can provide as part of the mandatory, conditional, or optional fields per the NG911 data model are really going to help make your data unique when it's all put together at a state level for hopefully what is the goal is geospatial call routing at a state level, right? So that's what we're talking about when we think about data completeness. It's some of the stuff that we don't typically think about, like state, county, and zip code. All right, guys, and I do want to just point out that we're 2 minutes over right now. I apologize for that. I've been very long-winded. I'm going to try and wrap this up here in the next 10 minutes. So I'm going to fly through some of this stuff, right? So I do apologize for that. So first off, I want to look at some validation categories. Road center line. And Sarah, if you want to go ahead and click through the animations, I'm not going to provide, I'm going to provide a little bit of detail, but with the time constraint, I'm sorry guys, I'm not going to be able to provide as much as I would like. Validation categories for NextGen 911 are going to be your road center lines, your address points, your boundaries, and your tabular. Think of this in terms of how we are comparing data, right? So our road center line data is going to match against our MSAG. Our address points are going to match against our alley. We're looking for things that have null fields, duplicate address points, overshoots and undershoots, boundary gaps and overlaps, and tabular data, just making sure we identify that data that exists in one, like our MSAG or alley, also exists in our GIS. Because moving into this next-gen environment, we're asking GIS data to perform the same functionality as our MSAG and alley. And in some cases, our MSAG may be too far gone to really leverage that as an authoritative data set for performing these validations or these data comparisons. And we may want to think about scrapping our MSAG altogether and creating what is called a geo MSAG, meaning we have more faith in our GIS data than we do our MSAG. So moving towards NextGen 911 compatibility, we're going to recreate our MSAG from our GIS data. I also want to talk about cross-jurisdictional validations, right? So that the list of validations I just showed you with your road center lines, your address points, your boundaries, and your tabular comparisons really pertain locally to you. But with our cross-jurisdictional validations, this is where we're comparing our data against our neighbor's data, right? Islands, gaps or overlaps in our boundary data, any three of those boundary layers. Do we have duplicate address points or duplicate road names and road ranges between jurisdictions? Are we using snap 2 points? Do we have road center lines that don't match each other at a snap 2 point at a boundary junction, right? So these are things that we want to think about and really identify a way to check for this type of information. Some of this stuff you're going to be able to start doing right now because I've told you some of the things to look for. Some of these validations you can't perform looking at tables side by side or overlaying them over top of each other. You're going to need some sort of validation engine. Here's an example of where a validation engine using fishbones creates an area that's really going to draw our eyes to. It's going to create a lot of confusion for us and really force us to dig into the information. So we can see that Stone Cliff Road shares the same right side road range for two different segments of the road that are not concurrent, right? So that's going to force address points to map to multiple road center lines, creating a lot of duplication. It's an easy fix, right? We're going to either change the address range so that they're not duplicate, or we're going to change the road name, making the road name more unique. Each of those decisions has its pros and cons, but potentially that's something you're not going to see unless you're able to see it on a map using a fishbone or a validation engine that's pointed you to it. You may have to write your own rules to do this or work with a third-party vendor to help you identify this. Right. The next one is really looking at address points that are not reflected in your road center line. Sarah showed you this earlier, and this also may get missed when we're doing just tabular comparison, right? It's an inconsistency in naming. So it's going to say that in our validation checks, it can't match 775 2nd Street to that address range on 2nd Street because we have an inconsistency in road name. We could also have a misspelling, or we could have a road that doesn't exist because it hasn't been updated, right? So this in a next-gen environment, if it is not going to validate in our LVF, our location validation function, and it's also not going to validate in our emergency call routing function, right? Because it doesn't have that match. It doesn't have that comparison. Right, and this next one, we showed this to you a little bit earlier, the duplicate address point. That could simply be due to a failure in SubAddressing. So SubAddressing would fix this problem 100%. So make sure you really understand the types of errors or anomalies that are being presented to you so that you can start quickly identifying the best method for remediation. And in this case, I can tell you it's going to be SubAddressing. Maybe it's currently not being tracked. Maybe it's a legacy issue and is now becoming an issue because we're able to point it out with NextGen. So some of this stuff is really simple. And again, these are just small examples of, one example pulled out of one of those different categories that I was talking to you earlier. There are several other different types or examples. This is just one. So please don't leave this thinking, all right, if I can identify all my duplicate address points, all the areas where I have, duplicate road names with ranges and inconsistency in naming, I'm good to go. It is deeper than that, but I did want to provide you examples. The next one is really easy. It's a gap or an overlap in our boundaries, right? So what happens in a next-gen environment when you have a gap or an overlap? You fail at LVF and ECRF. This is why those need to be consistent and coincident, and you need to work with your neighbors to identify you don't have any gaps or overlaps. Because if someone calls from that gap or overlap, we can't route the call correctly, right? So tabular comparisons to look at is our GIS to our MSAG, specifically our road center line to our MSAG. Do I have address ranges that match? Do I have road names that are consistent? Or abbreviations? Am I consistent with my abbreviations throughout? A lot of what's going to dictate that is going to be your CAD. So if you have a CAD that'll only support a 2-character road type, keep that in your GIS. But create a new field that has avenue spelled out, and you may want to add another field that has an avenue that has the three-digit abbreviation. And with our address points, we're looking for that one-to-one match, right? Because address points are supposed to be unique. SubAddressing could be that. Identify which is more accurate, your alley or your GIS. I'm going to tend to lean more towards GIS because we have the ability to touch that more and manage that better. Whereas the alley is typically not managed at a local level. It's managed at the telco level. And then this next one is topology. This is where I really tell you about you can't just do these validations at a tabular level because this is not right. This is really just looking at the spatial accuracy of our GIS data, where we can identify overshoots or undershoots, or polylines that are self-intersecting. These are going to flag as anomalies in a next-gen system and create a discrepancy report. What you don't get in that discrepancy report is a copy of your data that shows you where the anomalies occur. It just lets you know that a certain percentage of your data failed this check, right? So if you're relying on the spatial interface, LVF or ECRF to do your discrepancy reporting, you're going to have a search and rescue mission on your hands to figure out where in your data the anomaly occurred. But it is better than having nothing. Really what you're looking for is you're looking for a discrepancy report that gives you that percentage of your data that failed the data check, the validation check, but you also want the ability to get a copy of the data to show you where the anomaly occurred. Vendors out there that can provide that to you, I encourage you to do your research and do your homework to make sure if you're going to go with a partner or a vendor to help you with this, they're going to get you everything that you need to expedite your ability to remediate the data correctly. Which, what a great segue, right into data remediation, right? So data remediation is this cyclical workflow and process, right? To meet and exceed NENA standards, the standard documents that I provided you identify all of the different validation checks in each of those documents. This is not a one and done. Once you get your data to 98% and beyond, you have to have a workflow in place that's going to ensure you're able to keep that data at that high level, right? So think of this, it is a cyclical process. I show you a validation engine at the very top of this with the ability to run and rerun your validations as you correct your data or manage your data, right? Because we're not supporting local government business practice anymore. We're now supporting 911. So it's important that we think about things in this way. All right, guys. So what's the rush, right? Where's the fire? Well, I really want to point this out because some of this stuff is going to take time. And that's the rush, right? That's where the fire is. Understanding the governance roles behind data, identifying who the 911 authority is and making sure that person knows how their role is evolving in NextGen 911, because your 911 authority at the local level becomes the responsible party for the GIS data used to support NG9 on geospatial call routing. That's kind of a new role and a new responsibility for that person, right? So we want to make sure that the relationships are in place and the methods of communication are in place to continue to support that individual and support that process, right? We want to think about our GIS data provider, which is going to be your local government and your local agency, and then what that aggregation component looks like if you're looking to do a statewide deployment at the state level. How are you at the state pulling local data up? Are you implementing a validation process at the state level? When you do your aggregations, are you comparing data sets against each other to look for anomalies at boundaries? Right? It's all predicated on relationships. The successful implementation of NG911 is going to rely heavily on good relationships and good pathways of communication. It's also going to rely heavily on funding. We know that the FCC released last year about $109 million to support this NG911 migration, and we know that there's a new round of funding coming out in 2022. Sarah's going to have to correct me on that. So know that there's funding available, and there's funding out there to help you accomplish this task. I don't know what funding looks like locally for Wisconsin. Sarah has a better grip on that. But don't think of this in terms of something that you're going to be responsible to fund out of pocket. There are resources out there to help you if you need the help. All right.
Great.
We got our lab. Oh, wow. Sorry. Loud.
No,
That was loud.
great information. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Drew. We've got one more poll for everybody. And based on what you've learned here, what do you think NextGen 911 is? And Coulter, I'm going to leave it to you to decide how we use this time while people are answering this last poll.
You bet. So thank you. I do want to make a note representing WLIA and especially the technical committee here. With some of the activities going on at a statewide level, especially the State Department of Military Affairs having their gap analysis call for bid over the last couple of months, knowing that once that, I mean, at this point, that bid's been, as I understand, awarded, and that'll require the reconvening of WLIA's NextGen 911 task force, which consists of myself and several other GIS professionals, members of WLIA, of course, and really that'll be our chance as an association to help inform really where our NextGen 911 state and preparedness is at for the folks working with DMA to complete that gap analysis. So if that's something you want to be involved in, by all means, feel free to get a hold of either myself or Fred Yowsley. We're both on the technical committee and would love to connect you with that and help basically drive Wisconsin where we need to go with NextGen 911, which requires everything that Sarah and Drew have been talking about over the course of the afternoon.
All right, thank you. How are we doing on that poll?
We are probably at a good place to close it. We've got just about 2/3 of our folks responding, so I'm going to go ahead and close and share that.
Let's see.
Perfect.
Excellent. Excellent. Yes, and it really is, NextGen really is all of these things. But what we really wanted you to get from this presentation is the enhanced call routing aspect and using GIS integration as a decision-making process. So fantastic. We really appreciate you all sticking with us to this very end here. So we are actually on our second to the last slide to talk about just, again, why NextGen 911? Well, let's remember why we're doing this. If you want to go ahead and close the poll, that'd be great. Just very briefly, the benefits of NextGen are because we can bring in real-time text. We can bring in video. We can bring in picture. I don't know what's up right now, if the poll is still up, or if you can see this last screen. So now that we've gone over this, you can see that so much depends on your data accuracy and your completeness, and it's that completeness and that preparedness that we really wanted to bring to you today. And we'd like you to step away from this presentation with a clear vision of what your next step is. So what is your next step? We would love for you to reach out to us, and we'd really be happy to have a conversation with you about your next step. So here is our information for contacting us. Drew, thank you so much for helping me with this today. You always have great information and a wealth of knowledge and experience. And thank you, Jason and Jeremy and Coulter, for having us today. This is what we have. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah and Drew. I think we can take this as kind of a last call for questions as well. And I do have one that Mark sent us if you want to take that, Drew and Sarah, whenever you're ready.
Absolutely.
That's good. Yeah.
All right. That question is, what software do you use to create fishbones? It does not appear to be part of ArcGIS.
Okay, I can take that. So, Esri has actually produced a document that walks through the steps for how to create fishbones. You actually have to have, I think, an enterprise license level or something more than basic and they provide the steps. We also, as a service provider, we have SaaS software that we use that produces fishbones as a part of our analysis process. I'm happy to show it to you or talk through you with it and kind of show you what those results look like if you'd like. So it is something that we do as a part of our service offering, but there are instructions out on the web for how to do it in an Esri platform. It's not real intuitive, but it's there.
All
Great.
right.
Any more
And
questions?
what Sarah said. Any other questions? All right. I think that closes things out for questions. Otherwise, yes. Thank you so much, Sarah and Drew, and thank you to everybody who's attended today's webinar, Solving the GIS Puzzle in NextGen 911. As I think I mentioned before the webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email within the next day or two with a link to view a recording of this webinar. So on behalf of WLIA, and Sarah and Drew, I want to thank all of you for attending, and I believe Jeremy is going to roll through a few more announcements. And I think Jeremy might be muted. All right. Until they get back on the line, I'm going to go ahead and throw another shameless plug for one of tomorrow's events. For those of you who have a creative side, or those of you who have heard me yammering about mapping contests long enough, we're having a kind of a funsy COVID reaction mapping opportunity over the course of the next day or so. If you can email Grace White and or myself with a basic map of your COVID experience or what you want to do as we get out of COVID, feel free to do so. And Grace and I are going to go through a bit of a banter presentation during Thursday's lunch to basically show off, you know, the pieces of imagination that you doodled either in some webinar or in a work meeting weeks before this thing happened, or any old time, because it's good for us mappers to be imaginative. So feel free to send that our way. If you have any questions, by all means, feel free to get a hold of me as well. And another WLIA 911 resource, or 911, NextGen 911 related resource, is the WLIA address and road centerline standards that we've worked on over the course of the last couple years. Certainly something that a lot of us have been involved in and will figure into NextGen as well. If you're not familiar, certainly give it a look on our website. But I think either Jason or Jeremy should be ready to chat back on again. So I'm going to close my mouth and let them open theirs.
All right. Jeremy, are you available? Okay. Well, I would like to mention that we have the spring morning session tomorrow beginning at 8:50. The first 10 minutes are designed to let the individuals attending the meeting to get situated and make sure they're set up and running. This also allows us to make us some initial announcements as well about the following sessions during that day. Between the sessions, we'll also have some slides and polls and fun facts from our Platinum sponsors. With our Platinum sponsors, we would like to make sure we provide those experiences in an enhanced manner. Thursday evening, we also have a social night and also a happy hour following up our sessions. The happy hour is sponsored by Frank Conkling of Panic Consulting. Be sure to consider joining us for that. And later in the evening, again, we have a trivia contest for the social night. There'll be some prizes donated by Platinum sponsors, Graph Errors and GPI, ranging from $25 to $50 gift certificates. If you haven't yet signed up for that, please do. Finally, on Friday, we're going to have our special interest groups meeting, SIGs, SAGIC, MUG, Women in GIS. We also have our board meeting, and everybody's welcome to attend. Let's see. We also have considered, if you enjoy our content, please consider joining or donating to the foundation is for the kids. That is something that we really do use to recoup lost ability to fundraise during the raffle this year. With that, I would like to thank our entire board and their effort in helping us on this. A special thanks to our education committee, everybody that supported me in this particular effort. It's been phenomenal. We've really kind of changed the metric and what we've been able to do based on our abilities being virtual. So with that, I'd like to close out today's workshops, and please consider joining us tomorrow for our sessions. Have a good evening. Stay safe. Thank you.